There are confessions that come easy, and there are confessions that take a lifetime to form. Richard Carpenter has spent decades standing at the edge of a truth too heavy to speak aloud and too important to keep buried. He has given interviews, accepted awards, curated compilations, and preserved the musical legacy of the Carpenters with extraordinary dedication. But through all of it, a quieter, more painful conversation was always waiting. The one about his sister. The one about what really happened. The one that a grieving brother, an aging musician, and a witness to one of music's greatest tragedies could no longer afford to postpone. At 78 years old, Richard Carpenter has finally begun saying the things he spent 40 years carefully avoiding. Not in a dramatic press conference, not in a tell-all memoir with a provocative cover, but slowly, painfully, in the way that real honesty tends to emerge, in fragments, in interviews given late in life, in the quiet gravity of a man who has outlived his sister by more than 4 decades and carries that weight in every word he chooses. This is not a story designed to sensationalize grief. Is not a story built on tabloid speculation or recycled gossip. Is a story about a family, about an industry, about an era, and about a woman whose voice was so extraordinary that the world fell in love with it while simultaneously failing to protect the human being behind it. Karen Carpenter deserved better. Richard Carpenter knows that now, and increasingly, he is willing to say so. To understand Karen Carpenter, you have to understand the house she grew up in, because that house shaped everything that followed. She was born on March 2, 1950, in New Haven, Connecticut, the second child of Harold and Agnes Carpenter. From the outside, the Carpenter household appeared to be a stable, music-loving, middle-class American family. From the inside, it was a household with a clearly established hierarchy, and Karen was not at the top of it. Her brother Richard, born October 15, 1946, was 4 years older and had been identified early as the musical prodigy of the family. He showed a natural aptitude for piano, demonstrated an almost instinctive grasp of harmony and composition, and carried himself with a seriousness that adults around him recognized and rewarded. The family's attention, expectations, and emotional investment flowed in Richard's direction as naturally as water finding its level. He was the future the family was building toward. Karen grew up observing all of this. She was not neglected in any obvious or dramatic sense. She was fed, clothed, educated, and included in family activities. But there is a particular kind of invisibility that does not announce itself loudly. It simply makes itself felt through patterns, through whose name comes up first in conversations, through whose achievements generate the warmest responses, through whose setbacks cause the most concern. Karen experienced that invisibility from an early age, and she learned from it the lesson that would quietly define her life, that her needs, her feelings, and her ambitions were secondary considerations. Their father, Harold, was a gentle man, soft-spoken by nature, shaped by a childhood lived abroad among missionary parents. He loved music, maintained a substantial record collection, and filled the family home with sound. Jazz, classical compositions, popular recordings of the era, all of it flowed through the house and into young Karen's ears. She absorbed harmonies and emotional textures from recordings long before she had any framework for understanding them technically. Harold loved his children, there's little doubt about that, but love expressed without advocacy is a limited thing. When the family's dynamics tilted in ways that disadvantaged Karen, Harold did not push back. His gentleness, which was genuine, functioned in practice as passivity, and passivity, in the face of imbalance, tends to make the imbalance permanent. Agnes Carpenter was a different presence altogether. She was driven, opinionated, and deeply invested in the family's success, which in practical terms meant deeply invested in Richard's success. She was not a cruel woman in any cartoonish sense, but she was a controlling one, and her emotional attentions followed Richard with an intensity that left Karen in a permanent secondary position. The dynamic was not hidden. People who knew the family observed it. Moments that might have been trivial, a neighborhood baseball game in which Karen outperformed her brother, a small personal victory that disrupted the established order, were treated by Agnes not as reasons for pride, but as disruptions requiring correction. The message delivered to Karen through these moments was consistent and cumulative. Your success is acceptable only when it does not inconvenience anyone else's. In June of 1963, when Karen was 13 years old, the entire family uprooted from Connecticut and relocated to Downey, California. The stated reasoning was broad, but the actual purpose was specific. California meant proximity to the music industry, to studios, to producers, to the networks of connection that Richard's ambitions required. The move was made for Richard's future. Karen's life, Her friendships, her routines, her developing sense of place and belonging was treated as something movable, something that could be rearranged without meaningful consequence. She was 13 years old, at one of the most socially sensitive ages a young person passes through, and she was transplanted into an unfamiliar environment without anyone particularly stopping to ask whether she was all right with any of it. She adapted, because that is what Karen Carpenter did. Adaptation was her survival mechanism, and she deployed it quietly and efficiently throughout her life. Here is a fact about Karen Carpenter that tends to get overshadowed by the extraordinary quality of her voice. She was, by any serious measure, a genuinely exceptional drummer. Not a competent one, not a passable one, an exceptional one, recognized by peers, instructors, and music journalists who covered her work with the technical appreciation it deserved. She came to drums almost accidentally. In high school at Downey, she joined the school band primarily because it offered an alternative to gym class. The instrument she was initially handed, the glockenspiel, did not hold her interest. It was delicate, limited in range, and demanded a kind of restrained precision that did not match the energy Karen was beginning to discover in herself. Then she watched another student play the drums, and something changed. The drums were physical, commanding, and impossible to miniaturize. They did not ask to be pretty or small or invisible. They demanded presence. Karen begged to switch, and once she did, the transformation was immediate and total. Her parents purchased a Ludwig drum kit for $300, a meaningful financial commitment for the family at the time, and Karen repaid that investment with an intensity that surprised everyone around her. She practiced until her hands were raw. She drilled rhythmic patterns, jazz figures, and complex marching sequences daily. She studied under jazz instructor Bill Douglas, absorbing technique and theory with the same organic ease she brought to everything musical. Within a remarkably short period, she was performing at a level that her instructors described with unambiguous admiration. What is crucial to understand about Karen's relationship with the drums goes beyond the technical achievement. The drums gave her something that almost nothing else in her life had offered, a protected space. Behind that kit, she was not the secondary child, not the quiet observer, not the girl whose feelings came last. She was a musician doing something genuinely extraordinary, and the instrument itself provided a kind of physical and emotional shelter. She sat within it rather than standing exposed before an audience. She was part of the mechanism rather than the object of its attention. The drums let Karen exist on her own terms, which was a rarer experience for her than it should have been. In 1965, Richard formed the Richard Carpenter Trio. Karen played drums. The lineup was unconventional by any measure. No lead vocalist, a tuba functioning in the role of bass, arrangements that prioritized Richard's compositional instincts over commercial accessibility. Nobody expected much from them. In June of 1966, competing in the Hollywood Bowl Battle of the Bands, they won. Industry judges took notice. A contract with RCA Records followed. The RCA chapter did not end triumphantly. The label, uncertain how to position a group so far outside established formats, recorded the trio and then shelved the recordings. The contract was quietly allowed to expire. For Karen, who had already begun to demonstrate the vocal abilities that would eventually redefine American popular music, the rejection carried a particular sting. She had committed entirely to an endeavor that the industry was not prepared to value. That experience of pouring yourself into something and being told it was not quite what was needed, that would not be the last time Karen Carpenter encountered that particular response. When Herb Alpert signed the Carpenters to A&M Records in April of 1969, the velocity of change was almost disorienting. Within a relatively short period, a duo that had been recording in a garage found themselves with a hit single, a recognizable name, and the particular vertiginous experience of sudden public visibility. Karen was still behind the drums initially, singing while playing with a technical control that few performers could have matched. The combination of her vocal purity and her rhythmic authority was remarkable, and those who watched her perform during this early period recognized that they were seeing something unusual. But the music industry of 1970 was not particularly interested in unusual. It was interested in images that translated cleanly to television screens, photographs that communicated a legible story, presentations that minimized complexity. The problem, as industry figures framed it, was simple. Audiences could not see her. A 5'4" woman seated behind a large drum kit disappeared visually, particularly on television stages designed with different configurations in mind. The decision was made that Karen would move to the front of the stage. A touring drummer would be brought in. Karen would stand where audiences could see her clearly. This decision has been discussed frequently in the years since Karen's death, and it is often described in practical terms, as if it were simply a logical production adjustment. What is less often acknowledged is what it cost Karen personally. The drums were not a phase she was passing through. They were the place where her anxiety found its anchor. Standing behind that kit, surrounded by the physical machinery of rhythm, Karen had felt insulated from the direct scrutiny of audiences in a way that standing alone at a microphone never replicated. When she moved to the front of the stage, she did so professionally and without public complaint. She smiled. She connected with audiences. She performed with the gracious warmth that became her trademark. And internally, something shifted in a direction that would not correct itself. The exposure she now experienced every night, standing completely visible, completely measured, the singular focus of attention, amplified anxieties that had been present since childhood but had found a temporary refuge behind the drum kit. Control over her body, over her appearance, over the precise management of how she presented herself to the world, began to take on a significance that went far beyond ordinary concerns about professional presentation. The hits came. Close to You arrived in 1970 and changed everything. We've Only Just Begun followed. Rainy Days and Mondays. Superstar. Top of the World. The Carpenters accumulated Grammy Awards, sold tens of millions of records, and became one of the defining musical acts of the early 1970s. Richard's arrangements, lush and intricate and built around Karen's voice with extraordinary care, demonstrated a musical intelligence that critics who dismissed the duo as lightweight pop would eventually be forced to reassess. Karen's voice, that warm, impossibly natural contralto that seemed to arrive already fully formed, became one of the most recognizable sounds in American music. None of this addressed what was happening beneath the surface. By the mid-1970s, anyone paying attention could see that Karen Carpenter was losing weight at a rate that did not correspond to any ordinary explanation. Photographs from successive tours charted a visible trajectory. Television appearances captured a thinness that wardrobe choices could not entirely conceal. People noticed. Fans wrote letters. Journalists asked questions, carefully and not so carefully. The problem was that the framework for understanding what they were observing barely existed. Anorexia nervosa in the mid-1970s occupied a peculiar cultural position. It was known to medical professionals, but almost entirely absent from public conversation. The understanding that eating disorders were serious, complex psychiatric illnesses with significant mortality rates had not penetrated general awareness. What most people saw when they looked at Karen Carpenter was not a woman in the grip of a life-threatening illness. They saw a woman who was very thin. And very thin women in the entertainment industry were, in that era, more often admired than worried about. The language available to describe what was happening to Karen was wholly inadequate to the reality of it. Dieting, watching her figure, being health conscious. These were the terms that floated around conversations about her appearance, terms that normalized and minimized what was in fact an acute medical crisis. Even within her own family, where the changes were most visible and most alarming, the understanding necessary to mount an effective response simply was not present in any organized form. Richard has spoken about this in his later years with honesty that is clearly difficult for him. He has said that he and everyone around Karen genuinely did not understand what they were looking at. This is not an excuse offered carelessly. It is a description of a specific historical moment in which a particular kind of suffering had not yet been given the public language or the institutional response it needed. The tools to help Karen did not exist in the form they exist today. The conversations that might have reached her had not yet happened in any public or medical sphere that connected to her world. When the Carpenters canceled their 1975 tour because of Karen's health, the public statement was vague. The real picture was considerably darker. Karen's weight had dropped to levels that compromised her physical functioning. She was exhausted. She was struggling. And yet, because the mechanisms of denial and professional obligation and family avoidance all operated simultaneously, the response was a pause rather than an intervention. Things resumed. The tours, the recordings, the public appearances, the relentless demand for the smiling, perfect, gracious Karen Carpenter that audiences expected and the industry required. Agnes Carpenter remained focused on appearances and the maintenance of a family image that did not accommodate the kind of open acknowledgement that Karen's condition required. Harold remained gentle and non-confrontational, constitutionally unable to push for the kind of forceful intervention that the situation increasingly demanded. Richard, during part of this period, was managing his own serious health struggles, an addiction to prescription sleeping medication that eventually required him to enter rehabilitation, and was not in a position to provide his sister with the sustained, clear-eyed support she needed. Karen was surrounded by people who loved her in various ways and capacities, and who collectively failed to help her in the way that might have changed the outcome. She tried to manage it herself. That was another pattern deeply consistent with who Karen Carpenter had always been, handling difficulties privately, minimizing her own struggles, presenting the version of herself that caused the least disruption to those around her. She had been doing that since childhood. The illness, in a terrible irony, was in some way